They put the cuffs on him at 6:09 p.m. on a Friday evening in front of his own house, on the porch he had built with his own hands over 3 weekends in August, with the front door still open behind him and the smell of jollof rice coming from inside. He did not move. He did not raise his voice. He stood with his arms behind his back and his chin level, and his eyes on the middle distance, the way a man stands when he has trained himself over many years of difficulty to be perfectly still in situations that are trying to make him something other than still. He had been standing at his own front door, with his keys still in his right hand, when the officer arrived. The keys were now on the porch boards, where they had fallen when he was told to put his hands behind his back, and had done so carefully, without argument. The officer was 23 years old. His name tag said Pritchard. He had been on the force for 7 months and 4 days, and he had answered this call the way he had been taught to answer calls that matched a description. A large black male in the 4800 block of Doris Court in Fayetteville, North Carolina, reported by a neighbor as loitering outside a property, possibly casing it. The report had come in at 5:57 p.m. Pritchard had arrived at 6:06. He had found a man at the front door of 4822 Doris Court, and the man was large, and the man was black, and in 7 months and 4 days Pritchard had developed the habit, without anyone formally teaching it to him, of resolving ambiguity in a particular direction. He had reached for the cuffs. 2 houses down, a woman named Ama Darko stood at her kitchen window with a dish towel in her hands. Watching, she had lived on Doris Court for 11 years. She knew every house, every car, every face. She pressed the dish towel flat against the counter and picked up her phone. She did not call 911. She called a different number, one she had been given 4 years ago by the man who was now standing on his porch with his hands behind his back. Given to her along with the words, "If anything ever happens that feels wrong on this street, you call this number first." She called it now. She said 3 words. They got Dubem. The person on the other end did not ask questions. He said, "How long ago?" She said, 3 minutes. He said, "We're coming." What Officer Pritchard did not know, and what the neighbor who called in the report from behind her curtain 2 houses north did not know, and what no one on Doris Court in that moment knew, except Ama Darko and the man whose keys lay on his own porch boards, was that the man standing in cuffs had served 14 years in the United States Navy, the last 9 of them in a unit whose existence was not confirmed in any public document, had deployed to 6 countries in a single calendar year, and carried inside his body 3 surgical scars that were the permanent record of things that had happened to him in service of the country, whose flag flew on a pole at the left corner of the porch he had built himself in August. His full name was Dubem Nwosu, and he was 44 years old, 6'2", 211 pounds, though he had been 231 pounds when he separated from service 3 years ago. The 20 pounds had come off methodically, the way he did everything. A decision made, a process followed, an outcome produced. His body was his primary tool, and he maintained it accordingly, the same way he maintained the 2017 black Ford F-150 in his driveway, which had 94,000 miles on it and had never once failed to start. He was wearing dark green cargo trousers and a gray-fitted t-shirt and work boots he had laced that morning while sitting on the edge of his bed before 5 a.m. because he had not been able to sleep past 4:30 since he came back, and had made his peace with that. He had been finishing the last section of trim on the interior window frames when the doorbell rang at 6:04, and he had come to the door with sawdust on his forearms and his keys in his right hand because he had been planning to drive to the hardware store on Skibo Road before it closed at 7. He had a list in his left pocket written on the back of a paint chip card. 3 items. In his precise small handwriting: sandpaper, 220 grit, 2 packs. Wood filler, natural, exterior primer, 1 quart. He owned 4822 Doris Court outright. He had paid for it in a single transaction in March of the year prior, with money he had saved across 14 years of overseas pay, combat pay, and the specific financial discipline of a man who had no dependents. ate on base for 9 months of every year, and had never owned a credit card with a balance. The deed was inside the house, in a manila folder in the second drawer of the filing cabinet in his home office, between his DD 214 discharge papers and the title to the F-150. On the kitchen counter, where the jollof rice was cooking on low. He had put it on before he planned to leave for the hardware store. Timing it for dinner was a navy blue cap his mother had given him the week before his first deployment in 2009. The cap had the name of a secondary school in Enugu on it, gold lettering on navy, slightly faded now, and he wore it on weekends when he was working in the house. He had taken it off and set it on the counter when the doorbell rang because he had the habit, installed by his mother's training, of taking his hat off when he came to the door. The cap was still there. He could see it through the open door behind him, on the counter next to the stove, next to the pot of rice. He had a skill he had never been asked to name, because it was not the kind of skill that fits on a form. Over 14 years in the Navy, and particularly over 9 years in the kind of work that left 3 surgical scars, he had learned to assess any situation, any room, any street, any configuration of people and terrain within the first 4 seconds of entering it. Not nervously, not with fear. The way a carpenter assesses a wall, methodically, without drama, as a professional understanding the material he is working with. He assessed Officer Pritchard in 4 seconds, 23, possibly 24. 7 months on the job, the posture gave it away, too careful about the weight of everything, the way someone who has recently been given authority moves inside it. A genuine call, not a pretext. Pritchard believed he was responding to something real. And, underneath all of it, afraid. The fear was the most important variable. Afraid men with guns in their holsters required a specific kind of management, and the management required absolute stillness and absolute compliance, because the alternative cost too much. He had put his hands behind his back without being asked twice. Doris Court was a quiet residential street in a neighborhood called College Lakes, 12 blocks from the main gate of Fort Liberty, which had been Fort Bragg until they changed the name. The neighborhood had a particular character. Half of its residents were active duty or veterans. The other half were civilian families who had moved there for the school district. And the combination had produced, over 20 years, the kind of block where people waved from driveways and left packages on each other's porches and, in Darko's case, kept a phone number for situations that felt wrong. Amma was 61 years old, born in Accra, retired from the hospital laundry at Cape Fear Valley Medical Center after 31 years. She had a daughter in Charlotte and a son in Atlanta, and she talked to both of them on Sunday evenings. She had watched Dubem Nwosu move into 4822 Doris Court 3 years ago, watched him carry everything in by himself on a Saturday, watched him spend the following 6 weekends stripping the exterior paint and repainting it a deep charcoal gray with white trim, watched him build the porch from raw lumber, watched him plant 3 rose bushes along the front walk that had bloomed in July for the 2nd year running. She had brought him pepper soup the first winter because she had seen his lights on at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday and understood, without needing him to explain, what that kind of light at that hour meant. She was still standing at her kitchen window. Pritchard had not noticed her. He was talking on his radio, and the static from it carried across the yards in the evening air, which was cool and smelled of cut grass and still, from somewhere, of jollof rice. The sun was low over the roofline of 4818, casting everything in the particular flat orange light of a Carolina October evening. And Dubem was standing on his porch with his arms behind him and the keys on the boards at his feet, very still, in that light. Amma watched and did not look away. If you can feel where this story is going, stay with me, because what happens in the next 7 minutes is not something Officer Pritchard was prepared for, and neither was anyone watching. Pritchard had called for backup at 6:11. The backup unit arrived at 6:17. A second officer named Garfield, who was 31 and had been on the force for 4 years, and who read the scene in approximately the same 4 seconds that Dubem had read it, but arrived at a different conclusion about what required managing. Garfield looked at the cuffs. He looked at the porch. He looked at Dubem. He looked at the F-150 in the driveway, and the rose bushes along the walk, and the charcoal exterior with the white trim, and the open front door through which the smell of cooking rice was traveling clearly across the porch. He said, quietly, to Pritchard, "Who called this in?" Pritchard said he had a report of a suspicious person. Possible loitering, possible casing. Garfield said, "What does the report say exactly?" Pritchard checked his notes. He read the exact language back. Large black male. Possible loitering. Possibly casing the property. Garfield said, "The property." Pritchard said yes. Garfield looked again at the F-150, the rose bushes, the porch, the open door, the cooking smell. He said, "Whose property?" And that was when Dubem, who had been standing with his arms behind his back for 9 minutes without speaking, said in a voice that was completely level, "This is my house." He said it with the same tone he would have used to say the temperature outside was 46 degrees, or that the sandpaper he needed was 220 grit. A fact, stated for the record. Pritchard said, "Can you prove that?" Dubem said, "The deed is in my filing cabinet. Second drawer. If someone goes inside and opens it, they'll find it in a manila folder between my DDD 214 and my truck title. I'd show it to you myself, but my hands are behind my back." Garfield took one step back from both of them. He was looking at the yard. He was looking at the house. He had been a police officer for 4 years in a city that shared a zip code with one of the most prominent military installations in the world, and something in the way Dubem had said Deed 214, not explaining what it was, simply citing it, the way you cite a document you know the other person in the conversation will understand, was doing something to his understanding of the situation. He said, "What branch?" Dubem said, "Navy." A pause. Garfield said, "How long?" Dubem said, 14 years. The first vehicle came down Doris Court at 6:21 p.m. It was a dark gray Chevrolet Suburban. Clean, no markings. It parked in front of 4818 without drama, pulled smoothly to the curb, engine off. The doors did not open immediately. The driver sat for a moment before getting out, and when he did it the way a man gets out of a vehicle when he has trained his body to move deliberately in all conditions. He was big, 6'3", thick through the chest, with the bearing of someone who has spent years operating in the specific kind of darkness where bearing is all you have. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark jeans, a plain black long-sleeve shirt. He stood beside the Suburban and looked at the porch. His name was Chief Warrant Officer Kolade Achebe, retired, and he had served alongside Dubem and Wosu for 6 of the 9 years before they both separated. He had been at his house on Arboretum Drive, 11 minutes away, when the call came through on the teen group text. The text had come from a number Darko did not have. It had been forwarded by the man she had called, relayed in seconds through a chain that moved the way these men moved everything, without waste, without announcement, with absolute economy of action. He stood beside the Suburban and said nothing. He looked at the porch. He looked at Pritchard. He looked at Dubem. He clasped his hands in front of him and waited. The second vehicle arrived at 6:23. A white F-250, 4-door, parked behind the Suburban. The man who got out was 42, shorter, 5'10", with close-cropped hair and an old scar running from his left jaw to his left ear that he had carried since a night in 2017 that was not on any public record. He stood beside his truck and said nothing. The third vehicle at 6:25, a silver Jeep Grand Cherokee. One man. He parked across the street, got out, folded his arms. The fourth at 6:26, an older blue Toyota 4Runner with a cracked left side mirror and a small Ghanaian flag sticker on the back window. The man who got out was 51, gray at the temples, moving with the slightly slower economy of a body that had been through things and had not entirely recovered from all of them, and had decided this was acceptable. He stood on the sidewalk. By 6:29, there were 7 vehicles on Doris Court and 9 men standing on the sidewalk or beside their vehicles, all of them black, all of them large, all of them in civilian clothes, all of them completely silent. They did not shout. They did not approach the porch. They did not address the officers. They stood. Officer Pritchard had stopped talking. His hand had gone to his belt and then left it. He was looking at the sidewalk, and then at the porch, and then at the sidewalk again. His radio had made a sound, and he had not responded to it. Officer Garfield was very still. He had been on the force for 4 years. He had responded to calls near Fort Liberty for 4 years. He understood, in this moment, with the particular clarity that comes when a situation fully assembles itself in front of you, exactly what he was looking at. He understood the D-214. He understood the silence. He understood why none of these men had announced themselves, why none of them had moved toward the porch, why not a single one of them had raised their voice or made a gesture. They did not need to do any of those things. The standing was the communication. The standing was everything. He turned to Pritchard and said, very quietly, "Take them off." Pritchard said, "Aye," the call said. Garfield said, "Take them off now." The cuffs came off at 6:31 p.m. Dubem had been restrained for 22 minutes. He brought his hands forward. He turned them over once, the same check anyone makes after restraint, the confirmation that the body still belongs to the body. He picked up his keys from the porch boards. He did not rub his wrists. He did not make a sound. He looked at Pritchard. And then, after a moment, he looked at Garfield. He held Garfield's gaze for 3 seconds, not with anger, not with performance, with the specific measuring look of one professional assessing another, and then gave a single, small nod. The nod said something that was not forgiveness, and was not thanks, and was not defeat. It said, noted. He walked to the sidewalk. Kolade Achebe was the first one to move. He crossed the lawn, and the 2 men gripped hands and then gripped forearms the way men grip forearms when the handshake is not sufficient for the history between them. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then one of the men on the sidewalk, the older one with gray temples, the one from the Forerunner with the Ghanaian flag sticker, said, "Low and even. We eating, or what? Because I can smell the jollof from here." And Dubem, for the first time in 22 minutes, showed something in his face. Not a large thing. A small unclenching around the eyes. He said, "Come inside." What happened in the days that followed was not orchestrated. It assembled itself the way true things assemble, from the footage on the teenager's phone from 3 houses up, which went to Ama Darko, who sent it to her son in Charlotte, who had 17,000 followers on 2 platforms, from the incident report that Garfield filed that same night, which described in plain language a call initiated on insufficient basis, a restraint that was not supported by observation, and the subsequent arrival of a group of veteran service members whose conduct throughout the incident was, in his written assessment, entirely lawful and entirely silent. From the call the Base POW received Monday morning from a reporter at the Fayetteville Observer, from the call the Fayetteville Police Department's Public Affairs Office received 4 minutes later from the same reporter. Dubem gave one interview. He did it sitting on his porch, in the low morning light, with the navy blue cap from his mother on his head. He answered 6 questions. He used no dramatic language. He said that he had been stopped at his own front door, that he had complied completely, and that he had friends who came when friends were needed, which was a thing he had learned the value of a long time ago. The reporter asked him if he was angry. He said, "I'm a lot of things. Angry is somewhere on the list." She asked him what was at the top. He looked down the street for a moment, at the rose bushes along his own front walk, at the porch boards he had laid himself, at the F-150 in the driveway. He said, tired, she waited to see if he would say more. He did not say more. The interview ran on the Observer's website at 4:17 p.m. on Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, it had been picked up by 4 national outlets. By Wednesday evening, The Fayetteville Police Department had announced that the original call would be reviewed, that Officer Pritchard would be placed on administrative assignment pending a departmental inquiry, and that the department was commissioning an independent review of its call intake procedures for reports of suspicious persons in residential neighborhoods, the first such review in 8 years. Officer Garfield was not disciplined. The inquiry noted that his conduct from the moment of his arrival had been consistent with the department's existing use of force guidelines, and that his decision to remove the restraints had been appropriate to the circumstances. What the inquiry did not note, because it was not the kind of thing that appears in official documents, was that Garfield went home on Friday night and sat in his car in his own driveway for 24 minutes before he went inside, and that whatever he thought about during those 24 minutes changed something in him that remained changed. Ama Darko heard about the Observer interview from her daughter in Charlotte. She did not watch it. She had been there. She knew what had happened. On Thursday evening, she brought a second pot of pepper soup to 4822 Doris Court and left it on the porch with a note that said only, "Glad you're home." Dubem found it when he came back from the hardware store. He had made it to Skibo Road on Saturday morning, 2 days late, and bought the sandpaper and the wood filler and the exterior primer, and had spent Sunday finishing the window trim. And he brought the pot inside and ate at the kitchen counter and did not turn on the television, and the house was quiet. In the specific way, it was quiet when everything that needed to happen had happened, and the work could resume. The neighbor who made the call, her name did not appear in any news report, and this is deliberate, because the inquiry never named her, had lived at 4831 Doris Court for 3 years, which was the same amount of time Dubem had lived at 4822. They had never spoken. She had watched him build the porch. She had watched him paint the exterior. She had watched him plant the rose bushes. She had formed, in 3 years of watching without speaking, a complete picture of the man across the street, a picture assembled from surfaces, from the large frame and the utility clothing, and the early lights and the late hours, from everything except the truth of who he was. And from that picture she had drawn a conclusion, and from that conclusion she had picked up her phone. This is the older mechanism, not the violent hatred that announces itself, that is at least honest in its intentions, but the quieter thing, the thing that happens in the gap between looking and seeing, between noticing and understanding. It does not know itself as prejudice. It calls itself concern. It calls itself caution. It dials 911 and gives a description and hangs up and goes back to whatever it was doing and believes, genuinely believes, that it has done something responsible. The world is full of this mechanism. It runs on surfaces. It runs on a large frame and cargo trousers and skin that is the wrong shade in a neighborhood that had not been expecting it. It runs without cruelty, which is what makes it so difficult to argue with. It does not intend harm. It simply produces it, reliably, at scale, in the specific form of a man standing at his own front door, with his keys in his hand, being told to put his hands behind his back. The 9 men who drove down Doris Court on a Friday evening did not come to argue with this mechanism. They came to stand in front of it, silently, with their hands at their sides, in civilian clothes without announcement or explanation, because what they knew, what 14 years and 9 years and 6 and 11 years had taught each of them, was that the mechanism responds to one thing above all, the willingness of other human beings to show up and say, without speaking, that they see what is happening, that they will not look away, that the standing itself, the quiet, deliberate, unmistakable standing, is a statement about what a man is worth to the people who know him. You cannot build a case against standing. You cannot file a report against silence. The 9 men on Doris Court had understood this. They stood for 22 minutes, and the standing was the argument, and the argument did not need a single word. What Dubem Nwosu had carried for 14 years, across 6 countries, through 3 surgical scars, through operations whose names were not on public record, through nights that had installed a wakefulness in him that no amount of time had entirely resolved. Was not documented in the DD-214 in his filing cabinet. The DD-214 was a record of his service. What he had actually carried was something else. The knowledge that a man without people is carrying everything alone, and that the most important thing he had ever done in 14 years was not any specific operation or any specific theater, but the accumulation, over time, of the kind of trust that makes 9 men get in their vehicles on a Friday evening without being asked more than 3 words. Some things cannot be taken by a pair of cuffs. They cannot be taken by a call logged at 5:57 p.m., based on a description that fit a category rather than a person. They cannot be taken by 22 minutes on your own porch, with your keys on the boards at your feet. What a man is built, not the house, not the porch, not the rose bushes, but the real building, the human architecture, stands when he stands, and stands when he cannot. The pot of pepper soup on the porch on Thursday was part of that architecture. So was the Ghanaian flag sticker on the Forerunner. So was the number Ama Darko had dialed at 6:10 p.m., without hesitation, from a memory that had held it for 4 years without needing to use it until now. These are the structures that hold, not the ones that appear on deeds, not the ones that show up on dashboards or in transaction records, but the ones built quietly, over time, from the consistent practice of showing up for the people who are yours. Dubem finished the window trim on Sunday. He polished his work boots that evening the way his mother had taught him. You present yourself the way you wish to be received. He went to bed at 9. He woke at 4:31 a.m. and lay still for a moment in the quiet house, and then got up, because that was what he did, and went to make coffee, and stood at his kitchen window in the dark while the coffee ran, and looked out at his street. The rose bushes were still there. The porch was still there. The F-150 was in the driveway. The keys were on the hook by the door where he had hung them when he came home. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Here is the question I want you to sit with. If a friend called you at 6:10 on a Friday evening and said 3 words, just 3, and you knew what they meant, would you get in your car? And if you're honest with yourself about the answer, what does that honesty tell you about the people you've built your life around? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to read it. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.